Thank you a lot, Tobias Cheung. We didn't expect that much historical background when looking at these exhibits, but I would like to hook up with Tuur's initial proposals and motivations for this work. Can you maybe point out in how far this your own diving into this Asian context was deliberately made in order maybe to come to an end of this Western dichotomy, like you complained yourself, as we have been experiencing through both of your talks, that this organismic thinking that is not really embedded in a kind of dichotomic divide, that this is something which also may be abolishing a kind of unfructuous human-animal, human-machine divide, where you're driven by a kind of post-anthropocentric gesture when you wanted to produce this? Is this a cynical view, or was it just that you wanted to come to an end of what Tobias has mentioned as a techno-humanism?
Yes. No, I think it would. I remember the very early conversations we were having with Arts Catalyst when we were talking about wanting to make this organism, which is a fish. And when we started hearing about this goldfish culture in Japan, it seemed kind of appropriate that it was in Japan. So the answer is it was definitely not intentional, and I definitely, or both Revtel and I'll speak for myself, I definitely did not have the full understanding of the kind of historical, I guess, sort of being rooted in different ontologies on that side of the planet. It just seemed somehow, there was a gut feeling perhaps that it seemed appropriate to do it there. And then we were also making these two works in parallel, because making these works takes a while. And so we were developing both 75 watt in Southeast China, as well as making a lot of trips to Japan for Kinyo Kingdom, Sterile, and Sensei Ichigo. So I think it started out as a gut feeling more than anything else. And then the more we kind of found out about it, heard about it, spoke about it, it sort of felt right. But perhaps way less in a kind of academic manner as has been sort of put to the table this evening, but way more in a way that even Professor Yamaha was talking about fish, right? When he was giving us a kind of lecture about goldfish and fish in general, he was always, like, he had this beautiful PowerPoint presentation in which he was talking about how they're bred and how you can artificially breed them and this and all that, and it would always end up with a dish. And then he would say, and they're also very delicious. This is how you could cook them. And so it felt to us kind of like a different way of, a different relationship between him and these animals. So I think, say again?
Well, we would also eat fish.
We also eat fish, but I think it seemed strange. I've worked with some scientists here, and I think they would keep their food and their profession maybe more separated. It just seemed kind of so, there was a seemingly sort of transition between his research and fish anatomy and then cooking lessons. And it was all sort of within one PowerPoint going fluidly back and forth. I guess what I'm trying to say is that maybe our experience of these things has always been much more anecdotal and way less academic, which is why I invited you three clever boys here.
I wanted to ask also, I mean, you mentioned Galen also. I mean, Galen, where the organs in a certain way are conceived as, well, he speaks of the human as Mängelwesen, so we have to hypercompensate because some of our organs as a kind of equivalent of machines are not really up to the challenge, so we have to hypercompensate in order to become what we already are, which is basically also Galen's position. How would this Galen position resonate in the light of their work? I mean, there is not this hypercompensation in a certain way, probably in the Asian way of hybridizing the organism question with the living and the machine, the living machine thing together. I mean, would this be the same cultural?
Well, these three historical aspects that I presented are not exclusive. First of all, they're not logic, they're historical constellations. And second, you can add them up, so you can combine all three. You could combine projection, fusion, and then replacement. You could read it as an historical process. You could read Galen like somebody saying, okay, let's first take search for an evolutionary explanatory scheme why there are machines. Openness. We have not so clear patterns for the interaction with the milieu. We need these clear patterns to survive. So we have some patterns like organs or the hand and so on, and we can externalize their functionalism and produce machines. Second, okay, after a long time, if you have these Odyssey bone thrown in the air and then the space shuttle you see, then you find yourself in an environment where you have a heavily technolized environment and humans, and you think about what can we do with it now. You can just, improve this whole coexistence, make it not for survival better, but more comfortable in a way. And you have this kind of happy feeling of coexistence beside of Gideon. Gideon has also written a book, Befreites Leben, the freed life, because you have all these installations in the kitchen and so on. So this is a kind of a feeling you could attach, same period, 20s, Galen, then Gideon. And the third one would be where we are right now. But it would be a prolongation of the same history. It would just be that somehow now we get an uncomfortable feeling in realizing how far this coexistence go. And their values are touched. Certain values I try to refer to, like you put it in a theological scheme, you put it in a pragmatic scheme, you put it in a historical family scheme, and so on. Reproduction has a value in many aspects. And in your machine just points to the tricky thing somehow that, well, that's fine. Where's the problem of the coexistence? And now when he makes that machine, we feel uncomfortable about it. And we have to think about, is it just a feeling? Ignore it. It will go away. Or is there something like a search for a humanistic foundation in the movement? But then you're back into a whole story that we had already. Because if you look the whole development from behaviorism to the Althusser's Poor Marx against humanistic Marxism to structuralism is all nothing else as a series that want to say there is no human foundation, there is no self, there is no fear against technologization.
Are there questions in the audience that are motivated by fear? Because we have some minutes to go, and of course we try to be not really moralistic in this panel. You have understood that. So maybe, yeah.
I might have missed it, or maybe I was deconcentrated. But I wanted to ask, what exactly is the misunderstanding of the Chinese writing system that was at the base of designing formalisms and computation?
That's a bit of a difficult question because Chinese linguistics is exactly as difficult as it sounds. But basically what happened, you have to imagine that this was the first time anyone in Europe ever heard about the Chinese writing system. And if you take into account the speed of transmission of knowledge at that time, which means it takes ages to translate books, it takes years to send them to Europe, you can imagine how much, well, basically misunderstanding, misinformation there was. There were some people who said it worked like this. There were some people who said it was actually the pre-Babylonian language. There were some people who said this was actually invented by the devil because it will, never be understood. Some people said it's a totally divine language because they have no characters for genitals. So for 100 years or longer, basically up until now, there's a lot of infighting among Chinese linguists or very eminent Western sinologists about the history of the Chinese language, how it developed, whether there is a relation, and how this relation between the written Chinese and the spoken Chinese actually works. So it is very hard to pinpoint the exact misunderstanding of Leibniz, but the misunderstanding was actually that it was a universal writing system. This was the idea. They thought, we're looking for a universal writing system, maybe this is one, because there seems to be a correlation between a thing and a character. So basically each thing, it was describing the real, So, and at the same time, they had this thing that even today people say that, yeah, of course you have someone from Northwest China and someone from Southeast China. They will not understand each other's dialects, but if in writing they will understand each other, which is on some levels true, but still it's not true.
Hi, thank you for a fascinating panel. I just wanted to follow up with your opening apology that this is, in fact, a sterile panel, which is somehow very apt to the topic. And also the idea that, to come back to this idea that the real product being produced on the assembly line is the worker. And the way that you restage that by producing an object that choreographs the worker in a different way. But I wanted to ask about the sterile fish and ask, especially as it becomes evident in the pictures, and I haven't seen the film yet, that there's a production of the pigeon fancier and the fish breeder that appears very much to be a production of a kind of masculine subject, which is so much also present in the history of science that so what kind of subjects are being produced in these goldfish breeding operations, and how does that change in this production of a sterile fish? What kind of subjects are being produced with this new sterile organism?
That's a very good question, and it's also something that I may not be able to answer because I've only spent limited time with pigeon fanciers as well as fish breeders. But it's true that I need to think about it now, but I did not encounter even one female pigeon fancier. There were some female fish breeders. Yeah, it's difficult to pinpoint about what the reasons why they do this, or what is being produced, or who they become by becoming with this thing, which is or with this animal, right? With a pigeon, or with a bunch of pigeons, or with a fish. But it always struck me that they were not just men, but also men that were kind of almost like upper middle class people and often retired, especially with the fish breeders. So maybe there was, I don't know, this is my kind of high school psychology. Maybe there's a sort of thing with control going on where you can't fully control, I think, your pigeons or your fish or its appearance, so in many ways it felt to me like it was a relationship that was very different from the relationship we perhaps think of that we have with technology, or like kind of this engineering ideology that we were trying to unpack. But to really answer the question of what they become in becoming with this animal, I don't know.
Well, the kids leave, but the pigeons might come back,
Maybe. They don't always come back. Yeah, we were talking. I've been talking about this with many people, and a lot of. Maybe it's not just animals. People sometimes today, even in the gallery, someone gave me the example that her parents, after retiring, her father became this kind of really hardcore sailor. So she was looking at it more from a point of view of not just being with an animal, but just being part of nature and somehow, or whatever that nature might be, natural elements, I guess.
Might I have a question in the end? Because we were talking the whole time about sort of basically the relation between art and science and technology and theory and practice. While talking about an exhibition that I also had the opportunity to see last week, where the question sort of arises whether this is actually still art that we're talking about, and or whether this is something, because I don't know, at some point I have to say I get a little bit tired of this sort of art and science conversation where you always talk about there has to be a transmission between the two fields, but while actually seeing exhibitions like yours or by people like, I don't know if you notice, this group does Newman, where Julien Chaillet and people like this work, who produce work that is on many levels very indistinguishable from scientific practice, from engineering, from programming, and at the same time has a very, very high artistic value. So I think this is a question whether we are headed for a point where we might have to come up with new terminologies, or basically get rid of terminologies first, because the boundaries between these different sorts of endeavor slowly really start to merge.
Yeah, but then again, I think if you do work with scientists, you also do start to, like, I think their processes are very creative and often very intuitive and often way more off the wall, I'd say. I mean, the reasons why Professor Yamaha is doing all this research with fish, to me, are way more shocking than many kind of provocational pieces of art I've seen. So even though that perhaps they may be very kind of provocational, intuitive, and kind of self-driven, autonomous, I do think there are entirely different processes.
I think so too, but the separation, we behave as if the separation of art and science has always been that way. Basically, it started exactly around 1600 with the time frame I picked. Before that, many fields of what we today call science were considered art.
Yeah.
So it's not a very old thing, and it might change again. It's not forever, I think.
No, it's true, and in fact, it's also one of the reasons why very early on we were very interested in synthetic biology, because synthetic biology was this kind of interdisciplinary field, I guess it was still considered within the realm of science and engineering. But what I thought was really interesting in it, that it was also a kind of experiment in social engineering, because it was deliberately set up in order to take place with very young students. So that iGEM was, for example, this kind of undergraduate competition in synthetic biology, which it was a genius move to do it with undergraduate students, because they hadn't really sort of consolidated within these silos yet. So I think that perhaps was also the opportunity for us to then engage with these people, because if you'd come as an artist, you'd still be an outsider, to work with these people. They'll be a bit more open to that. I just kind of, even though that, yes, these boundaries have not always existed, I do think that they're very different worlds, and it's a very difficult process that I'm also very wary of fetishizing, and I think that it's also something that we refuse a lot of platforms in which we feel like the art science thing is too much fetishized for us to present our work. And that's just a personal feeling in which we say, well, look, we want to talk about the ideas that we're trying to explore through these processes, but we don't want to we don't always work with synthetic biology. We don't always want to work or collaborate with a scientist.
I don't know when we are going to be kicked off here, so you have to tell us. And if we have still time to take a last question, maybe for the audience. Do we have? No, we don't have. Okay. So then we hope that it was indeed a fruitful discussion despite the sterility of the topic, and the panel members, and thank you for attention. And yeah, please go and visit this show, Unter den Linden Sharing Foundation. It's up there up to the beginning of May until the 3rd May precisely. Thank you for attention.